Guys, today I'm going to talk about how to start self-educating. Now, I've been pursuing education and learning things for a long time, and it's one of the things that's really expanded me most in my life. For someone who's done it for a long time, it's almost difficult to explain how much reading books and studying things has actually expanded how I understand things. Like, it's just a part of who I am. The knowledge that I have is almost like an extra limb. It's like if it ceased to be in my head, it would be like if one of my arms was chopped off. It just simply is a part of my being. All the information that I've brought into my mind, into my being, and it really helps me comprehend and think the way that I do. But if I had to restart my education journey, this is generally what I would do. So, one of the ways that I've really loved to self-educate, and what I really pursue, is what I'd call almost a bastardized classical education. A classical education is really rooted in the classics. It's in reading the great books. And that is really the number one thing that you can do to become more educated. There's nothing that beats it, in my opinion. I haven't found anything. Now, there's lots of other things, too, that you can do. You can watch long form, or less stimulating sort of informational content on the internet, and you can watch lectures. Things like that are very valuable, are very helpful. But really, the number one thing that I've found is reading the great books. Now, a full classical education is going to have you learning Latin and Greek and possibly Hebrew, and it's going to be like classical Greek or Koine Greek or something along those lines. I don't necessarily advocate for that at first, because most people will not have the ambition, unless you're really into languages, to learn a dead language just to start reading these great books. First, you need to learn to love the great books, and then if you love the great books enough, you might pursue being able to read them in their original language because you love them. But I would say start with your vernacular language, especially because we have such good translation these days. We have access to translations of these books that are way better than, our ancestors did. Now, that doesn't mean that I think it's bad to learn these dead languages. I actually think it's great. But it may not be the easiest thing to pursue for most people, although there is ways, such as, Duolingo, or whatever it's called, has Latin on there. I've used that a little bit, and it's rather interesting, and it could be helpful in learning these languages, or you could pursue it even heavier in a classroom setting. But if I was looking into starting an education journey, I would look at reading the great books. Now, the first book that I would read, I wouldn't even necessarily consider this a great book, but I believe it's called A Little History of the World. Maybe it's A Small History of the World. I'm forgetting it off the top of my head. I read it when I was younger, and I've read it a couple times, actually. And it's just a great comprehensive overview of world history, especially focusing on the Western world. This book was really impactful for me because it made me understand how world history fits together. Now that I've read a lot more history, every time that I've gone back to that book, it seems really simple and basic, but the first time I read it, because so much of the information was new and the way it put it together, really put the picture of how the world fits together. It put the picture of the world, how the world is. It put it into framework for me, and that's what's so powerful about that. And when you get into the great books, you're going to be reading books from all different time periods, all across the world. So having a brief overview of world history is actually very valuable when you start your education. So I'd say start with this book. I think it's called A Little History of the World, but it could be A Small History. So it's one of those two. You'll find it when you look it up, though. The next book that I would read is probably the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. This book is really interesting because it's the book that got me into actually realizing that you could read the great books for yourself. Now, I actually, before this, had been reading lots of great books for years and years, but my reading had never really stemmed outside of it had never really gone outside of the 17 or 1800s. I don't know why that is, but I just kind of presumed that, you can kind of read old books, but I didn't realize how far back you could read great books. Now, of course, to some degree, that was really quite stupid, because I had read the Bible, which is obviously a very, very old book, but I just never thought you could read figures like Plato, read all these ancient figures. And reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, because he's always talking about these ancient books and these ancient works, made me realize how much further back you can actually read. And it made me start pursuing reading these ancient books. It's actually reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin made me read The Republic. And and also just looking at the founding fathers and studying some of the founding fathers is really, really interesting because they have a sort of intelligence, they have a sort of education that is completely absent from the modern day. Even most modern scholars don't have the same sort of education. It's not that they have Modern scholars have very great education in specific fields, but it's that broad, diverse education. It's that sort of expansive sort of thinking that these classically educated individuals that I think is really exemplified in a lot of the early American figures, such as Benjamin Franklin, can be really, really valuable in reading their autobiographies or just reading general biographies. Another person to look into is Thomas Jefferson is really interesting because you really start to see how intelligent these people are, and it makes you think, what did they have that we don't? And I really think it is reading the great books. It's reading the great works. And when you read the great works, you want to read, so I would go history, Small History of the World, Little History of the World, whatever that book's called. You're probably going to think this guy's really stupid, and fair enough. I mean, I'm not saying I'm super smart, and if somebody like me can actually learn as much as I have and can read the great books as well as I have, somebody like you who's probably naturally way smarter than me can probably do a lot better. But I would start with A Little History of the World, move into the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, because that will just really root you into what somebody who's classically educated can speak like, can think like, can achieve. And Benjamin Franklin is just so interesting because he was self-educated, and he was also self-made. He made his own fortune, but he also wound up educating himself. And that's a rare thing. You don't meet a lot of people who were self-educated and became as smart as Benjamin Franklin, and you don't meet a lot of people who were self-made and became as rich as Benjamin Franklin. And really, autobiographies just inspire me in general. That's probably the most inspiring genre to me, is autobiographies. Now, after you read that, I'm not going to give you exact book recommendations. I'll give you some ideas, but once you've read those two books, I would say just go crazy. Go where you're interested. But I would recommend you read from a great deal of time periods, from a great number of different locations, from a great deal of different schools of thought. You don't want to get stuck in just reading one genre from one time period from one place. Now, it isn't bad to study those sections deep, but when you're first starting, and for all of your life, you want to have a broad understanding of all the perspectives of world history. C.S. Lewis wrote a really good essay in the beginning of On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius about reading old books. And he says the value of reading old books is obviously a paraphrase, but the value of reading old books is that often we make mistakes in our modern day that ancient people did not make. Now, often they make mistakes that we don't make today, but it's very easy to see that from our perspective. But often, on the other hand, we make mistakes that we can't see. We're just blind to them, whereas ancient peoples could clearly see through those, and looking from their perspective helps us see our own mistakes. Now, here's a couple kind of general book recommendations. So I would recommend considering looking at some of the ancient Greek writers. Obviously, the Iliad and the Odyssey is really the beginning of the Western canon of great books, but I would tend to recommend looking at shorter works. I might make a video on a collection of short books, and when I say short books, I mean that if you were to listen to them on audiobook format, and audiobooks are also a great way to get in more books. I don't recommend reading exclusively audiobooks, but audiobooks and physical reading is a great way to learn. But I do say if you can get audiobooks in while you're driving or whatever, it can be really helpful, or while you're out on a walk, especially if you're really busy like I am. Audiobooks are great. But find short works. So, for example, you could look at The Apology by Plato. That's one of my favorite works. I read it pretty far into my reading journey, though, so maybe it won't impact you in the same way it impacted me. But, I mean, that work is awesome. I read The Republic before I read The Apology, but The Apology is way shorter, and it's really just as classic and great as The Republic. If you have time, though, The Republic is better. You'll get a lot more understanding of who Plato is through The Republic, but The Apology is just excellent. That would be a great start if you want to start really ancient in Western history. If you want to start a little bit more modern, You could read some of Emerson's essays. Emerson writes a little poetically, but I like Emerson a decent bit. I like Emerson a lot. You can obviously read, some of my favorites are the Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch's Lives is obviously, as one volume, is a very, very big book. But it's a collection of bioses, which is a type of ancient biography of a lot of different ancient figures. And these biographies are great. I mean, it's where we get some of our core information about figures like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And reading the biographies of these major figures is really inspiring, and it's really exciting. And it's just a really fun genre to read, especially if you're a guy. I don't know how it affects a lot of ladies, but if you're the kind of guy who's pretty energetic, then hold on, I'm gonna like depressurize my nose. Like, this ear is like vibrating when I'm talking, so I'm gonna like. You ever do that when you're in like a car? But that's what I would look into. I would look into some of these shorter works. Obviously, a lot of the books of the Bible, which are great classics, which you're going to have to read eventually if you want to become well and diversely educated in the classics, a lot of them are very short. They really aren't all that long. You can read through a lot of the books of the Bible. I would recommend starting with the Gospels, though, and if you want to start New Testament. Probably Mark is the shortest of the Synoptic Gospels, and then John is rather unique, so I'd recommend reading those two books of the New Testament. And if you want a letter or an epistle, you might want to do, let's say, Romans, or they're shorter ones. You could do Philippians, is really good. Or if you want what they call the Catholic epistles, which are the wider epistles in the New Testament, you could read Hebrews. Hebrews is probably my favorite of all the wider epistles. Now, Old Testament, I would probably go Genesis. It's kind of long, but it's still on the pretty short end when it comes to books. And it's really foundational to how New Testament and Old Testament figures think about the world and how they understand the world. And this understanding is going to be essential for studying the Middle Ages, because obviously the people of the Middle Ages were steeped in the understanding, in the biblical worldview, in the biblical understanding of the world. If you want, now, another great figure to look at is church fathers, theologians from the Middle Ages, because these figures are the thinkers of the Middle Ages, and they're just as important to Western thought as the ancient Greek thinkers are, as Plato is. So don't neglect the church fathers or figures from the Middle Ages. St. Augustine's On the Incarnation St. Athanasius' On the Incarnation is one of my favorite works. Augustine is a figure from like 40 years later who's also very major and probably is the most essential figure in Western theology. Athanasius is probably the most important figure in all of theology, especially Trinitarian theology. But he's more of an Eastern figure. He's a Greek figure. So where I would start out is try to find a lot of different short books. When I say short books, is if you find it on audiobook. I feel like that's the easiest way to tell how long a book is. Like, you don't have to listen to it on an audiobook. Just figure out how long the book takes for somebody to read it audibly, and then you'll know about how long it is. I'm saying about 3 hours or less is a great way to start, unless you're really, really interested in a specific book or a specific figure. Because it's not like you can't read longer books. No, that's great. I'm just saying that if you want to widely get an overview of Western history, read a whole lot of books from a whole lot of different time periods, from a whole lot of different perspectives. That's how you're going to quickly get yourself classically educated. And if you're reading really, really long books, it'll take a long time before you can do that a lot. But if you're really interested in a specific long book, read it. And obviously you're going to need to read the long books anyways. So don't make this a hard and fast rule. I'm just saying, in general, I would recommend looking at reading more diversely. So this is going to be my video for today. I kind of just rambled and yapped for a little bit, so hopefully you enjoyed it. Yeah, my thoughts are a little bit here and there today. I don't know what's going on with but my brain is just kind of everywhere. And I was having a hard time recording this video before I started, but I feel like it went pretty well now. So thank you for watching. Have a good day. Bye.